Hello, it's Sue Stockdale, the Association for Coaching podcast host here, and today I'm speaking to Jeff Hull, Director of Education at the Institute of Coaching and Clinical Instructor of Psychology at Harvard Medical School. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, I also understand that you are author of the book Flex, The Art and Science of Leadership in a Changing World. And some of the concepts within that book you'll be speaking about in your session at the Coaching in the Workplace conference. So I'm sure the audience will be keen to find out more about that. I'm wondering, first of all, Jeff, thinking about that word flex in your book title, what do you think makes it easier for leaders to flex their style?
First of all, the key there is recognizing the importance of not having just a one-trick pony style anymore. I think there was a time, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when if you were an up-and-coming leader and you were going through leadership training or even coaching, you would get a pretty standard description or prescription for what would be considered effective. Learning how to craft a vision, learning how to motivate people by being directive and delegating. And all of that is still relevant. But in today's world in particular, it is really important that that be only one approach that leaders utilize when they have diverse teams and they're looking to create creative, inclusive, high participation and high performance. And so the key for me is, as coaches, we need to help our leaders develop flexibility and to develop an awareness of their strengths, what they do naturally, and then an ability to stretch and expand. And that's where the intersection between coaching and leadership effectiveness and developing flexibility becomes really crucial.
So that idea of the need to flex and the ability to flex, I kind of see there may be a difference between those two things. The kind of aspirational recognition that one has to change and adapt. Are there some leaders you think that find it easier to do that than others? And what methods can help them to develop flexibility?
Well, I think the first thing they need to do is understand what they do well and what their natural predisposition is and what they've developed as habits and practices over a period of time. So and many of my clients are very successful as leaders, very high, even C-suite or even a CEO. And in order to get to a high level as a leader, you have to have developed some effectiveness, some way of working with your people that works. So you may have developed a style that is directive or visionary, or you may have a coaching style, or you may have an empowering approach to your team, all of which can be great. But in order to develop a flexible, agile way of working as a leader, it's starting from recognizing what you do well and then seeing how you could expand in different dimensions. And that's where having some examples and where coaches can share anecdotes of working with leaders that are effective but do things very differently. So just quick example, working with someone who's highly directive, who tends to be authoritative, who tends to be very decisive, all of which can be great under certain circumstances. But then all of a sudden you share with them as a coach an example of a leader who is really at the other end of the spectrum in the way that she might work with her team, being more inclusive, brainstorming, being collaborative, being inquisitive, the kind of person who's more democratic, who goes around the room and gets input from everyone or makes a collective decision. And you can imagine that your authoritative client looks at you and says, that's not me, which is true to a certain extent. But in order to develop agility, the opportunity would be for that leader to see where developing more of that style and more of that capacity could actually make them even more effective.
I see what you're saying there, Jeff. Now, in your book, one of the things that was really interesting to me was you described the arrival of the beta leader as opposed to the alpha leadership style. I'm wondering that the exemplar you just gave us of that type of more collaborative enabling leadership, is that what you mean by the beta leader, or is there something else?
No, that's pretty close. I mean, I think the labels alpha and beta are somewhat arbitrary, as are all labels. If you've read my book, then you know that I also had a few comments to make about millennials versus boomers and other categorizations that we do, which is very natural for humans, that we have a tendency to want to group people together. And it can be valuable in terms of understanding where they're coming from, can also be create separation. So I'm always a little cautious whether I start labeling my leadership clients alpha or beta. They may actually be a little bit of both depending upon the circumstance. But I think, to your point, there is a definitive distinction that I've discovered in working with more and more diverse leaders. And this is really one of the key themes of my research and of my book, that as leadership develops a portfolio, effective leaders, the portfolio of leaders grows to include people of color, women, people from different cultures, that what we discover is that there are so many different ways to be effective. And a traditional alpha style that I've already mentioned a couple of times is a more authoritative, sort of type A, decisive, rational approach to leadership. But a more beta style leader tends to be a collaborative leader, tends to be more focused on building consensus. And again, it's not that one is right or one is wrong, but ideally what you want to do is develop two things. One, the ability to adapt to the situation as a leader, to read the audience in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, and then be able to shift your style as appropriate. And two, be able to step back and think about what do people need in this situation to get the best decision, to get the best creativity, to get the best level of engagement. And it may be that an alpha leader needs to develop more of her beta characteristics, and vice versa. And that's really kind of the core of the premise that I use when I talk about alpha and beta. They're really sort of just two sides of a coin or two ends of a spectrum.
That makes sense. Now, the opposite face of leadership, I might argue, is the ability to be a great follower, because otherwise, who do we have to lead if no one's prepared to follow us?
Right. I love that.
And I'm wondering, what do you think causes us as an industry, perhaps, to focus more on leadership development rather than thinking about the concept of followership development? Because my sense is in that world of empowering people and stepping back as an enabling type of leader, one has to also be prepared to be a good follower, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. And I think that is actually one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, one of the reasons why I'm really interested in helping my clients develop leadership agility. Because at the end of the day, your goal really as a leader is to craft a vision with other people and then to enlist and empower and motivate and align such that everyone is moving toward an impactful goal, whatever that is. And there's absolutely appropriate times for a leader to step back and engage and empower others to lead in partnership or to be a follower. And so I think that true leadership agility starts to recognize the power of followership, to your point. And the good news is, I think that the transitional state we're in as a profession or as for coaches is to start to really help our clients become more aware of the power of followership, and that it's the tried and true sort of type A leadership is useful, especially in emergencies or in urgent situations. But there is really an important role for stepping back and for leading from the back or leading from the front, and having the ability to recognize the distinction and the value of being a follower at times, because that's actually how we develop the next generation of leaders.
And following on from that point about followership,
Right.
followership, Jeff, I'm thinking about your experience, obviously, in the world of psychology. And often I observe that people who have the more of the command and control type of leadership, it's sometimes about their need for recognition about what they are doing. And the followership means we've got sometimes subsume our own individual need for recognition in a different way. to achieve the results for the team. So I'm wondering, how could we help people to manage that conflict that might be in their mind about still getting a need for recognition, but doing it through other people and allowing others to take the lead and the leader become the follower?
I love that question because I think what it points to is really the heart of where a coach can be incredibly impactful. Because often the kind of practices or habits that effective leaders, especially if they are more authoritative and decisive and highly rational, they get in the practice of using the pronoun I. And ironically, the simple tweak of recognizing the value of incorporating we and being inclusive can have an incredible impact on your team. And what a coach can do with a client is have them reflect on why is it that they have to or need to or have developed a practice of being at the front with their languaging, with their presence, using that I word, using sort of that power stance. What is the benefit they get from that? As you point out, it may be a form of recognition, but it also could be based on some level of insecurity or fear that if they relinquish that sense of I-ness or being the center of attention, that they're no longer an effective leader, or that their people are not ready to step up. I mean, there could be a whole variety of reasons why they do that. But I think that's the power of coaching, is we have an opportunity to explore and then help our clients see the potential benefit of actually just making small tweaks. I've had clients who literally have just made small changes, like incorporating the pronoun we into their Zoom calls, right? And being more inclusive, or going around the room and saying, we are all in this together, and recognizing that what an incredible difference that makes. People feel more connected and they feel more engaged. So it is a wonderful question. And I would be an armchair psychologist if I tried to say that I know why every leader shows up the way they do in terms of their need for recognition. But I think that your question gets to the core of why coaching is effective also, which is helping our clients develop self-awareness. Not that they're doing anything that's not appropriate, but it may need to expand. It's like playing a musical instrument and only knowing one song, but knowing how to play it really, really well, right? You want to learn a whole variety of music.
And in that journey of adaptation, Jeff, one might also argue that it comes with experience and over time. So the more we've developed that musical ability to play one song really well, we might find it more uncomfortable or difficult to then adapt and learn some new songs. How can you encourage, you've talked about that great example of just changing the I to a we, and it can have a profound effect on the team. Are there any other observations you've made that of small changes that leaders can take that will have a potentially impactful benefit on their teams?
Oh, absolutely. If we had all day, I could think of probably dozens of small tweaks that can make a huge difference. But I'll just share one, as probably would be considered pre-pandemic, but I think it's still relevant, even though we're all working more from a virtual space. But the awareness that leaders can have around how their energy and the way they handle themselves physically actually impacts others. So eye contact, the reason I said pre-pandemic is because most of my clients would work from conference rooms, right? And if they have a tendency in a long oblong table to sit at the head of the table every single time they have a meeting, or to sit behind their desk, just becoming aware of the physicality, the energy that's created by symbols and rituals, like where you sit or how you show up physically. And so some of those very small tweaks go, if you're not in a virtual situation, to go in a room without a table and to sit in a circle. I mean, it really changes the whole feeling. And I actually think that's one of the great things about the fact that there are silver linings to the situation that we're experiencing, which is that the Zoom and other virtual setups actually kind of take away the hierarchy, and they create opportunities for us to be together in new ways. So there are a whole variety of tweaks that you can make as a leader to create a more engaging, more inclusive, more participative environment for your people.
Those sound like some great ideas and practical things that people can do immediately, Jeff. I guess I'm curious also to know, in your journey, in your career, how did you discover coaching? Where did it show up for you?
Well, I would have to say that if you go back far enough, and I mean like to my early professional career, it was actually through failure. And I think, as you know, many of us go through crucibles. I often will use this with my clients to recognize that sometimes when you learn from something that doesn't work, how to expand and grow into your next great self, right? So I was a director of HR at a consulting firm called Booz Allen and Hamilton. And in my role as a HR director, I did discover that I loved the component of that job that included mentoring and coaching and counseling. And fortunately, as an HR person, you do get permission to do that. The failure was that I had a few very difficult senior executives that I decided to coach, and I wasn't as well equipped to do it as I thought I was. So the long story short, I kind of got ahead of myself.
Yeah.
But that led me on a journey of recognition that there are skills and awarenesses and capabilities that you really need to develop if you want to be a good counselor, if you want to be a good supporter. So, I went back to school and studied clinical psychology and have over time then parlayed that back into a role as a leadership coach. But I think that the bottom line for me is that I learned that I loved coaching early on, but that I wasn't very good at it early on. So it was for the best, ultimately. That's one of the reasons why I am a big proponent of being part of the Institute of Coaching, because our commitment is to help develop and grow really highly professional and evidence-based coaches.
And that was where my next question was going to go, because you've obviously got the job education in your job title now. Where is the world of education and coaching heading, Jeff? What are some of the things that are on your radar these days?
Well, I think that the good news is that coaching has become a profession. And, back when I started, coaching was something that either people didn't talk about or didn't do, or it was considered remedial. But it was certainly 20 years ago, sort of in the back room. And now I think it's really front and center for most development teams in organizations that want to take their leadership to the next level. They incorporate coaching in multiple ways. And in order to do that effectively, the good news is we have developed some really good research on what works. And so my commitment as the director of education is to support the researchers to continue to expand the evidence-based practice, the foundation that we have in all the different domains of coaching, whether it's health and wellness or positive psychology or leadership coaching. There are now some really solid underpinnings around what works effectively through actual research studies. And I think that comes right up to where we are today as a profession, where the kinds of things we're asked to work on is what I did write about in my book, which is helping leaders become more agile. And that kind of agility does require a coach to have a very strong learning agility approach in their own way of doing coaching. They're to be constantly looking at their own growing edge, because we have to be role models for the kind of partnership, for the kind of communication, for the kind of curiosity and listening that we expect to transmit to our clients.
So coaches have got to be role models themselves. They've got to walk the talk and continue to learn and work on themselves to be of best support and use to their clients that they're working with.
Absolutely. I mean, I am a huge fan of my friend and partner, David Peterson, who always talks about the difference between a good coach and a great coach. Is a great coach is constantly on a learning journey, that they're looking to develop their learning agility with their coaching practices and their coaching capacity. And I think that's just mirrored in the way we want to work with our leaders and with our clients, so that we represent a ongoing learning journey. And then that becomes something that's reflected back to our clients. And getting back to your earlier question, at the end of the day, our type A alphas or our type B betas, they're not going to develop agility if they're not motivated and have an aspiration to grow themselves. So that's where coaching as a profession is so powerful and so impactful, because if we can represent as coaches that developmental path, and we can share some of those studies or examples or case studies, that can get them inspired. And that's what we want to do to motivate our clients to also be on a learning journey.
So we've had this thread through our conversation today about agility, about flex, about that ability to change and adapt, Jeff. I know you've got a framework within your book, I understand, that helps to support that leadership agility. I'm wondering what insights you can offer us from the framework.
Well, yeah, the framework was developed through research that I did with focus groups and interviews with a large number of coaches. And ultimately, what I was looking for was to determine whether or not what I was seeing in the coaching, in my own coaching practice, was a fluke or whether it was actually something that was happening on a broader base. And the good news is that
it's no fluke.
It was not a fluke, right? That the coaching practice that I'm doing has evolved, and the coaching focus that other coaches are doing all around the world has also evolved. So the framework really developed into trying to slice and dice what we do as coaches into categories that simplify and gave me the opportunity to hone in on particular leadership capacities that are really crucial to developing flex or agility in today's world. So, for example, decision making. We are often called upon to ask our clients to think about how do they make decisions. Are they authoritative, type A, alpha, or are they more consensus driven? Are they more collaborative? And why and when in different situations? Secondly, would be communication. How do they share and inspire with stories or with facts? Alpha type leaders tend to be very rational and data driven. A more beta approach tends to be a storyteller or someone that shares through inspiration. So you can see and there are 6 categories. I don't know if I want to take the time to go through all the categories, but there are specific areas. Another would be emotional agility, which is obviously really important these days for developing agility. And there are different sides to each of the 6 categories.
It sounds like there's a rich cornucopia of information within that book, Jeff, that people will find. And I'm sure that will also be partly incorporated in your presentation at the conference. It's been fantastic to talk to you today, to learn a bit more about you, a bit more about your ideas and some of the data that you've observed in your experience as a coach and a leader yourself. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I look forward to being part of the conference. And yes, during my session, I actually walked through case studies with all 6 of the dimensions. So hopefully that will be valuable to the folks that join us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff, for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sue. Take care.